Okay, let's move on. What I've argued so far is that the Gospels depict the resurrection of Jesus as a real objective occurrence. By which I mean that they understand it as an event that took place in time on one April Sunday morning. Not that they had Sundays back then until Jesus was raised from the dead, but some April Sunday morning, probably in the early 30s of the Common Era. It took place in time and it took place in space. It occurred in a tomb in the vicinity of Jerusalem. That the New Testament writers do not understand the resurrection of Jesus as the persistence of Jesus' memory or spirit or power or influence. They understand it as the persistence of Jesus himself. This Jesus whom you crucified, God has raised, was Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. Therefore, the resurrection story does at one level belong to the sphere of history. It is open to historical inquiry by scientific historians, if such things exist. It's open to historical inquiry. It is not open to final proof, but most of history actually isn't open to definitive proof. In history, you really deal with levels of plausibility. But it is open, I suggest, to historical analysis. And that's what I want to do in the next few moments. But we do face a number of real difficulties when we approach the question at the level of history. Pinning down what actually happened is extremely difficult for at least these three reasons. There are no witnesses to the event itself. Nobody ever claims to have been there when Jesus got up from his burial slab and was raised. No gospel writer attempts to describe it. They simply affirm that he was raised, or that God raised him on the third day and made him to appear, Acts 10:40. So you could say then that the resurrection event itself is not an observable event of public history. You can't go to somebody and say, what did you see actually happen? Because nobody ever claims to have seen it happen. They see the results of what happened, but not the event itself. Therefore, our understanding must always be contingent on that fact. It's going to be partial and incomplete. Secondly, and this has probably struck you in reading the Gospel accounts, the resurrection narratives in the New Testament, of which we have 5 or possibly 6 if you include 1 Corinthians 15, are very divergent in detail. There are lots of discrepancies in terms of the time and the place of events, the number and identity of persons involved, how many angels were encountered and whether they were angels or gardeners or Jesus, what actually transpired in those hours after Jesus rose from the dead. Now, there have been many gallant attempts to harmonise the resurrection accounts. And the problem with these harmonies is not so much that they're unconvincing, but they're unprovable. They all involve a great deal of speculation and guesswork, and therefore the harmonisations of the accounts are almost as diverse as the accounts themselves. These divergences in the resurrection narratives in the Gospels do not, however, undermine necessarily their historical value. This is, you couldn't just say, oh look, they all disagree on details, therefore none of them are worth anything, they're all rubbish. In fact, that discrepancies may even enhance the trustworthiness of the evidence. Historical data often has conflict in it. Again, this is not unique to the resurrection accounts. Different participants experience events in different ways. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable because people remember things differently, and so historical records often are full of discrepancies. But more importantly, the conflict in the accounts shows that the resurrection narratives in the Gospels are not artificially contrived. If they were deliberately fabricated, you would expect more effort to have been shown to remove discrepancies. If this was just a story that was concocted, then you would expect more effort to be put into actually making the accounts agree with each other. So the discrepancies in an account, in a funny kind of way, actually argue for the significance of these records of the event. And perhaps the discrepancies are an indication that the event that is being narrated is so awe-inspiring and so unusual that it's probably not even possible to hammer down in a matter-of-fact way all the precise details. The accounts themselves read more like sort of hurried, puzzled, somewhat scrambled recollections of extraordinary occurrences. And we know that trauma does sort of scramble people's memories. And maybe the resurrection accounts are a kind of reflection of the enormity of what people had encountered. And you wouldn't expect them to be as organised and as consistent as, say, the Passion account is, which the Gospel also has discrepancies, but is pretty much the same story told by all the four Gospels. Whereas in the resurrection stories, although there are core events that are common to them all, there is a great deal of divergence as well. The third thing that makes hammering down the historical events themselves very difficult is that the event that is being described is totally unprecedented. Now, there is a sense in which all historical events are unique, unrepeatable occurrences. The wheel of time only turns once. But the resurrection is unique in a unique sense. If you like, it's uniquely unique. It is without precedent or recurrence in all of human historical experience. It's a one-off event. Now, of course, I've already indicated that the Bible does occasionally speak of other dead persons being raised to life. And we know of near-death or after-death experiences today that have been widely reported and studied by people as well. But the resurrection of Jesus is not depicted as one further kind of example of a resuscitation to natural life, to natural mortal existence. Instead, there is the claim that he has been raised to a completely new form of immortal, if you like, supernatural existence. And the New Testament accounts of the resurrection of Jesus indicate that his risen state was both continuous with and discontinuous with his earthly state. It stands in both continuity and in discontinuity. There is a continuity between the risen condition of Jesus and, let's call it the pre-risen condition, his normal earthly pre-Easter experience, in at least these two important ways. It's the same person that is involved in both. It's the same Jesus. This Jesus whom you crucified, God has raised from the dead. The same Jesus who inhabits now a different kind of bodily experience. But it's the same person. And the second important area of continuity is that he inhabits a real tangible body. It's not a ghost-like apparition that the Gospels are recording, but it's a person whose body could be seen, it could be touched. Luke even says that it had flesh and bones, whatever that means. That he could eat and drink. That it even still bore the marks of crucifixion. It's a real body that the risen Jesus inhabited. But it's not like the body he had before. The discontinuity lies in the fact that Jesus' risen body is no longer subject to the same constraints of time and space that his natural body was. Again, when you read the stories, you get this coming through in a variety of ways. Jesus apparently could appear and disappear at will, even enter locked rooms. There are occasions in which his friends failed to recognize him for whatever reason, creating doubt or disbelief. And the risen body of Jesus, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, is different from the natural body because it is not subject to what Paul calls corruption, to decay, to change, to gradually moving down towards death. So according to our New Testament data, The earthly body of Jesus underwent a radical transformation into a new form of physical existence. And Wright coins the term trans-physical existence, a physicality that's been transformed. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, describes this new resurrection state as a spiritual body, soma pneumatikon, and he contrasts it to a natural body. Natural body is what we all have in this room. The spiritual body is the resurrection body. Now, when you think about this term, spiritual body is an odd kind of phrase because we often think spirit and body are kind of mutually exclusive realities. So what does it mean, a spiritual body? Well, I don't think it means a body composed of spirit or a body composed of jelly or sort of transparent kind of stuff, or ether or smoke, the Casper the Friendly Ghost kind of body. Rather, I think what Paul means by this phrase is a body that shares in the properties of both the material and the spiritual realms at the same time, or a body that is transformed to suit the conditions of renewed creation, restored creation, a creation that is permeated by the Spirit of God, and a kind of bodily experience that is appropriate to this new reality. So, the resurrection of Jesus is depicted then as a unique happening, unparalleled in previous history, and without recurrence since. An act of new creation. But when you think about it, that makes it extremely difficult for us to study as a historical event. Because historical events are usually interpreted on the basis of analogy. So we have no access to past events, but we think we can understand past events by assuming that they will be analogous to things that we do experience now. So there is a kind of correspondence between our regular experience in the present and the experiences in the past. The principle of analogy is one of the principles of historical study. But with the case of the resurrection of Jesus, there are no analogies. This is a completely unique event, a uniquely unique event, which makes it difficult to find the categories to understand. And so what we have is the gospel narratives of odd things happening. You have Paul's profound reflections in 1 Corinthians 15, which were no doubt shaped by his experience of the risen Jesus. But beyond that, we don't really have the language to describe this particular occurrence. A skeptic could say, well, you're asking me to believe all this odd nonsense. But the oddness of what is claimed for Jesus speaks in favour of something unusual having occurred. Something must have happened to produce this unprecedented and extraordinary description of Jesus' risen state. Something must have occurred that led to this kind of reflection. In Jewish thought in the first century, resurrection hope was largely understood as the reconstitution of the present physical body to continue living a kind of life that we know now. That's why all this effort was taken to preserve the skeleton, because the risen body was a kind of revivified natural body, sort of a return to natural existence. They didn't envisage the kinds of changes that are attributed to Jesus' risen body. Paul, who was once a Pharisee, would have assumed this common Pharisaic view. Something must have happened to produce this shift of understanding in the way he describes the resurrection state. What was that something? It wasn't something he borrowed from Jewish theology. It was something he found in the Hebrew Bible. That one of the really interesting things about the resurrection narratives is almost no what scholars call intertextual echoes of the Old Testament. In the Passion narrative, they're full of images from the Old Testament, Psalm 22 in particular. So the whole Passion narrative is told as though it's the fulfillment of Old Testament scripture. When you turn to the resurrection narrative, there's none of that. There's no Old Testament echoes there. This has not been made up in order to fulfill. In fact, when Paul says that he was raised according to the scriptures, people say, well, where in the scriptures does it talk about this? It's quite difficult to know what he's talking about. So the resurrection narratives are not concocted to fulfill the scriptures in that sense. It presumably came from recent concrete experience, that what Paul's reflections and the early Christian narratives come from is the experience of something unusual happening to Jesus' body. So, the resurrection of Jesus, odd though it be, is presented as a real historical event. In the final analysis, it seems to me that there are really only 4 possible explanations for the emergence of the Easter story, and every one of them has been suggested. Some attribute this to the influence of Oriental myths of dying and rising gods. Most Oriental religions were fertility cults, and the death of vegetation in winter and the growth of new vegetation in spring was understood as the kind of dying and rising of the gods. And some have said that's where the resurrection hope came. These Oriental myths were taken over and influenced Christian belief. However, the accounts of resurrection in the New Testament is quite different than these mythological stories of dying and rising vegetation gods. The New Testament accounts lack the typical characteristics of myth. Myths are typically ahistorical and develop slowly over a long period. Stories of the resurrection of Jesus emerged within weeks of his death. They involved named people, named places, and particular times. This is not the normal discourse of mythology. Myths usually are anonymous. They cannot be traced back to any known source. They are folk tradition that are shared by whole communities. But we know who discovered the empty tomb of Jesus. We know who owned the tomb. We know by name who saw the risen Jesus. This, unless one uses the term myth in a very broad sense, seems to me to be quite different than the mythologies of the ancient Near East. Was it a deliberate fraud? Was this a story made up for selfish and polemical reasons, or apologetic reasons? We know that even in the first, at the time of Jesus in the New Testament, that people were claiming that the resurrection was a fraud perpetrated by the disciples who stole the body. Later on, others have claimed that Joseph of Arimathea stole the body. Or there is even a story, I think it's Tertullian who records it, that the gardener removed the body to protect his plants from spectators coming to visit the tomb. So is this story of the resurrection just really a fraud perpetrated on the gullible? Well, I don't think that's very plausible either. What motive would the disciples have had for embarking on such a deception? What would have induced them to engage in such unethical practices? Is it plausible that they could have stolen the body and disposed of it without anybody finding out? According to Matthew, the Gospel, the tomb was sealed and possibly guarded. There's also been a whole scholarship done on frauds, and one of the interesting things about frauds is that they nearly always get blown. Somebody usually finds out. Piltdown man and all that. Especially if there are several perpetrators involved, somebody usually breaks ranks and tells the truth. But there is no indication of that. Instead, we have a picture where those who believed in the resurrection of Jesus managed to convince very large numbers of people that they had seen Jesus, and these other large numbers of people also claim to have seen the risen Jesus. Why would a deception like this spread so widely? Would a deception have the power to transform the disciples into willing martyrs who were prepared to go to their deaths in defence of this belief? And again, the discrepancies in the account, I think, tell against the fraud hypothesis, because you would expect greater care to have been taken to make the story watertight. Was it then an honest mistake? There are, I think, 3 versions of the mistake hypothesis. One is that Jesus never really died in the first place. that he swooned into unconsciousness on the cross, was thought to be dead, was taken down, put in the tomb. In the cool of the tomb, he came back to consciousness again, left the tomb, people saw him and jumped to the conclusion that he'd been raised from the dead. It's all very speculative, however. All the available data we have describes a public execution of a well-known person. And as Tom Wright Riley puts it in his book, Roman soldiers were rather good at killing people, and they made sure they did the job properly, especially a rebel leader who they had political reasons, Pilate and his supporters, to make sure was well and truly dead and buried. There are also several incidental details in the accounts that indicate that Jesus was thoroughly dead when he was taken down from the cross. There was no need for the soldiers to break his legs to speed his death. One soldier, John tells us, made doubly sure by thrusting his lance into Jesus' side. Pilate was surprised at the speedy death of Jesus because you weren't supposed to die quickly. Crucifixion was about a lingering death, and so summons the commander of the execution squad to confirm the fact that Jesus was dead before he released the body. Joseph of Arimathea treats the body as a lifeless corpse, wraps it in a shroud, and is buried in his family tomb. Again, the evidence that we have indicates that Jesus did not merely swoon on the cross, he really died. And those who suggest that he simply swooned perhaps are underestimating the horror that he went through being crucified. Another version of the mistake hypothesis is that the distraught women went to the wrong tomb and found the tomb empty and therefore jumped to the conclusion that Jesus had been restored to life again. This is extremely improbable. The tomb was readily locatable. It belonged to a prominent citizen. It was near to Golgotha. Golgotha was close to Jerusalem. It would have been easy to find. We are told that the women witnessed where and how Jesus had been buried and knew where to go back after the Sabbath had expired. It's improbable they would have forgotten the location. Again, would an initial mistake like this be repeated by everybody else, including by the owner of the tomb? As strictly speaking, anyway, the tomb was not empty. There were grave clothes in the tomb. The body had gone, but the grave clothes remained. It wasn't so much a vacant tomb as a vacated tomb. If it wasn't Jesus who vacated the tomb, then who did? So unlikely, I think, that it was a mistake in that sense. Probably the most common explanation that's offered today by scholars is that the disciples and others had a kind of hallucination or an altered state of consciousness sort of experience, or visions or dreams, or some kind of extraterrestrial, it's not quite, extrasensory kind of experience. Again, I don't find this convincing for a number of reasons. The most important is the last, but let me mention some of the others first. The disciples were not in the kind of state of mind that would induce hallucinations. The preconditions for hallucinations were lacking. Hallucinations are usually a matter of wish fulfillment, but there is no indication the disciples wished that Jesus would rise from the dead again. The indications are that they thought that he was a failure and that their hopes were in tatters. Hallucinations are usually, not always, but they're usually individual experiences of fleeting duration. They're not usually, although there are exceptions, they're not usually collective events. Is it credible that there would be parallel hallucinations taking place over wide territory by lots of different people, all reaching the same conclusion? The New Testament accounts also tells us that some doubted their experience, and others fiercely resisted the conclusion that he had been raised from the dead, hardly signs of visionary ecstasy. But the most important argument against the hallucination hypothesis is this. Why would people who had visions or hallucinations of Jesus jump to the conclusion that he had been raised from the dead? Those two things don't necessarily go together. You might have a dream or a vision about somebody. You don't then conclude on the basis of that dream or the basis of that unusual experience that person has been raised from the dead and transformed into a new form of physicality. Why not just conclude that the person is now living with God in heaven, or that this is an angelic visitation, or that this is a vision in some sense rather than an experience of an actual person? What led the followers of Jesus to move from their experience of him post his death to the conclusion that he'd been raised from the dead, when lots of other possibilities would have been much more natural? That he'd ascended to be with God would have been, a common way of thinking about this. But instead of that, they reached the conclusion that he had been raised from the dead. So this then, I think, leaves the possibility that we are actually dealing with a real historical event. And what I want to do in the time that remains is just to identify the rather striking pieces of evidence that can be mentioned in support of the claim that Jesus was truly raised physically from the dead in a bodily sense. Now again, this is not proof. Every piece of evidence that I mention could be explained in other ways. But I think when you see the cumulative effect of these considerations, at very least, I think you must be driven to conclude that people who do believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus are not in cloud cuckoo land, that there really is substantial reason for believing this. The first piece of evidence concerns the empty tomb. All four Gospels have the story of the tomb being found to be empty. They differ in several details, but they agree that Jesus' body had vanished. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of Jesus being buried and being raised, which surely implies he too believed in the empty tomb. We cannot prove that the tomb actually was empty. Professor Gearing dismisses the empty tomb story as a legend, without any historical foundation whatsoever. Others, however, think that's a bit too simple a response. And one ancient historian even writes, and I quote, "The emptiness of the tomb must be regarded as one of the most secure facts of the ancient world." Why would he say that? Because there are lots of considerations that speak in favour of the reliability of this tradition. One is the antiquity and the simplicity of these narratives. These are some of the oldest narratives in the New Testament, and they're certainly the oddest and most mysterious stories that the New Testament records, and yet they remain remarkably simple and unadorned. There is little evidence in them of elaboration or embellishment with fantastic features, which you do find later on in the Apocryphal Gospels, but you don't find in the canonical Gospels. They are very straightforward, very simple stories of women going to the tomb and finding it empty. Yeah, they experience angels, but that wasn't so unusual in the ancient world. But the story of the empty tomb themselves, again, doesn't have the signs of a gradually growing legend. Added to that is the use of female witnesses. Women were not regarded as reliable historical witnesses in first century Jewish society. Their testimony did not count in court. The claim that the tomb was empty because a group of women had found it to be empty was ridiculed by the early opponents of Christianity. Celsus famously ascribed the story to hysterical and deluded women who simply wanted to impress others with their story. Fabricated accounts would scarcely give the leading role to unreliable witnesses, unless it was actually a group of women who found the tomb to be empty. And to simply tell the story as it occurred required women to be present. It's interesting, Paul doesn't mention women in 1 Corinthians 15 because it wasn't a way of strengthening the credibility of the claim, but the Gospels all ascribe it to the experience of some women. There is no indication of the authorities disputing the emptiness of the tomb. I mean, think about it. The easiest way to discredit this outrageous claim that Jesus had been restored to life again was to go to the tomb and produce the body. But they did not do so, presumably because they could not do so. And so Matthew says a story was put about that the disciples came by night and stole him away. Grave robbery was common in the ancient world. Interestingly, there has been an inscription found in Nazareth from the time of Emperor Claudius, which was in the early 40s, threatening execution to anybody who was found guilty of tampering with tombs. That this decree would be issued in an obscure village in Galilee probably reflects the widespread knowledge that the tomb of Jesus had been found to be empty, and suspecting that its emptiness was due to grave robbery, an imperial decree was issued threatening capital punishment for anybody who violated a tomb. There is no evidence of secondary burial being attempted. No story of the followers of Jesus going back a year later to put his bones into an ossuary to await the resurrection. No actually evidence in the New Testament or for the next 2 or 3 centuries of any interest whatsoever in the tomb of Jesus. It was Emperor Constantine's mother who went and found the tomb and made it a place of pilgrimage. The early Christians showed no interest in the tomb at all. They did not follow the customary practice of gathering at the tomb of a dead prophet every year to remember his deeds and to offer worship on his behalf. The tomb carried no significance whatsoever for the early Christians. Why not? Because Jesus wasn't there. That wasn't the place where he was to be recalled. So these indications, I think, support the historicity of the empty tomb story. Of course, the fact that the tomb was empty doesn't mean that he was raised from the dead. It just means that his body wasn't there. And you can explain the absence of his body in a variety of ways. It's what seems to be most credible. One view that is quite often argued today by scholars like John Dominic Crossan and others is that the reason why Jesus' tomb was never venerated is because people didn't know where he'd been buried. He'd either been left on the cross to have his body eaten by vultures or by dogs, wild animals, because he was a criminal, or else his body had been thrown into a common grave that was considered too shameful a place for anybody to visit. And so the reason why the tomb of Jesus was never honoured is because nobody knew where he'd been buried. What I find very interesting about these suggestions is that they're offered as a refutation of the historicity of the empty tomb without there being any evidence whatsoever for the counterclaim. There is absolutely no textual evidence that Jesus' body was left on the cross to be eaten by vultures. All the details point in the opposite direction. So what makes that a credible suggestion rather than the other one? And also that would have gone contrary to Jewish practice, who, even with crucified criminals, did show a great concern for the dignity of the body. So, the empty tomb story is a very significant piece of evidence. But the New Testament places even more emphasis on the fact that Jesus was seen to be alive by many witnesses. The New Testament records several sightings of Jesus. Some 12 separate occasions are recorded when the risen Jesus appeared to individuals or groups. And for the sake of time, I won't go through these, but all the Gospels have their own list of appearance stories, and Paul has a list as well in 1 Corinthians 15. Just 3 quick observations about these appearance stories. In all of them, the emphasis falls on the recognition of Jesus. This wasn't some vague mystical experience, but a concrete identification of someone whom they knew well and remembered. Not always did they recognise him first up, but the stories always end with them recognising that this was Jesus. Jesus not only appeared to them, he spent time with them. He walked with them, he talked with them along life's way, whatever the hymn says. He ate and drank, he listened to teaching, he taught and they listened to his teaching, they touched him, so much so that Luke says in Acts 1:3, he presented himself alive to them by many convincing proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. And then thirdly, the resurrection appearances add a dimension of verifiability to the resurrection claim. This is very clear in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul goes through and he lists all the people that Jesus appeared to. The implication being, if anyone doubts that this actually happened, then go and talk to Peter or James or John or to one of the 500, most of whom are still alive, he says to the Corinthians. Go and ask them about their experience if you doubt it. The unprecedented nature of the claim, again, I've already mentioned this, but it's something that supports the historicity of the resurrection claim. The suggestion that anybody would rise from the dead in bodily form would be highly unusual, and it would require convincing evidence to persuade people. People weren't as gullible in the ancient world as we sometimes assume. But the added claim that Jesus had not merely returned from the dead, but he inhabited a wholly new kind of body, that it was the first instalment of a new creation, was an entirely novel claim. Something must have led the first Christians to this novel assertion that the final great resurrection at the end of history had moved into the present in the experience of Jesus, and that this was being mediated to others in this kind of twofold way, that people could experience the first shockwaves of that in their inner life and then the full Monty later on. What would actually explain the origin of this claim? True, dead men don't rise, unless something entirely new has broken into human experience. Or as Wright says, the fact that Jesus' resurrection was and remains without analogy is not an objection to the early Christian claim, it is part of the claim itself. This is what makes it significant. It's not, I said, a kind of repeatable miracle. It is a unique event in the history of creation. And then finally, the transformation of the disciples. Something needs to be posited to explain why this fearful, bereaved, guilt-ridden, disillusioned, demoralised band of followers, whose hopes that Jesus was the one to redeem Israel, were in absolute tatters. Some hiding in Jerusalem for fear of their opponents, others returning home to pick up the pieces of their life again. What transformed them into this bold, joyous, courageous company who proclaimed publicly that the murdered Jesus was the Son of God and the Messiah and the very author of life itself? Something that they were prepared to endure floggings and imprisonments and even martyrdom for, a courage that astounded even the Sanhedrin. What could have produced that? A colossal mistake? Or an experience that had such a compelling power that it led to transformation? What transformed Paul? Great act of divine comedy, this, where God took the leading opponent of the Christian movement and turned him into the greatest exponent of the movement that we have ever seen. What led to that transformation? Paul did not gradually come to the conviction that Jesus had to be the Messiah because he fulfilled all the scriptures. He was literally knocked off his horse, or if he was on a horse, or knocked on the ground on the Damascus Road by his experience of the risen Christ. There are other changes as well. The day of worship shifted from the Sabbath, which is a Saturday, to the first day of the week, which is Sunday. Why? Why did the early Christian movement, as totally Jewish as it was in its origins, start to honour the first day of the week? Because that was the day the tomb was found to be empty. That was the day that Jesus was thought to have been raised from the dead. Attitudes towards the Torah changed as well. The Torah was no longer the centre of their lives. That place was occupied by the risen presence of Christ. Their views of the Gentiles changed as well. They were no longer to be excluded, they were now to be included. Clearly something changed the disciples. They said it was their experience of the resurrection. I said that was the last thing, but there is one more thing, which is where we began tonight, which is the veneration or worship of Jesus. Within the first decade of early Christianity, Christians, followers of Jesus, began to speak of Jesus in divine terms. Extraordinary, really. They began to take texts from the Hebrew Bible that spoke of God and applied them to Jesus. So Paul can say in Philippians 2, "At the name of Jesus every knee shall bow and every tongue confess." He's quoting Isaiah 45, which is speaking about everybody bowing the knee to Yahweh, to the God of Israel. What led to the worship of Jesus? Well, I suggest it was the experience of the resurrection. So, last sentence. The New Testament, I believe, affirms that the resurrection of Jesus was a real, objective, historical event that took place in time and space and that affected the physical crucified body of Jesus. It is not the persistence of his memory, spirit, power, or influence. It is the persistence of Jesus in transformed form. It's a historical event, yet of course it's more than a historical event. It's unprecedented. It's a kind of supra-historical occurrence that transcends all the ordinary categories that we have, that inaugurates a new condition of human experience. The historical foundations for this claim, I think, are impressive. They cannot be easily dismissed, but they will never amount to proof. Ultimately, it is a matter of faith. But it is precisely that faith that has persisted for the last 2,000 years and continues, I think, to energise the gospel around the world. Right, comments or questions or criticisms? Preferably comments and questions, but I'm open to criticisms as well. Is it believable? Yes.
Can you speak to me more about why the Pharisees had a resurrection story? Or what the basis?
Well, I think the question is, why did the Pharisees, or that's true in Judaism, believe in the resurrection of the body? I think it's a logical outcome of belief in the goodness of creation, belief in the faithfulness of God, belief that God will eventually restore his people, and that the martyrs who have died in fidelity to this God will be vindicated. And the only kind of vindication that makes sense of a kind of creation theology is the experience of continued life in this world. It's not the only conclusion, but I think it's the most logical conclusion to reach from. So I think it's a growth out of that kind of worldview. Yes?
It's difficult with the Zohar, the Kabbalah's book. You know that?
I don't know it personally. No, I don't. Yeah, I know the Jewish mystical traditions. Yep.
And so in that they have basically most people have seen the Kabbalah tree of life is not here. Tree of life. And the crown on top and the material at the bottom. And subsequently the material is our spirit, or not included in the spiritual kingdom. And so subsequently the material is very inferior to that of the crown.
Right.
Such a rising of Jesus' material body would be considered very insignificant even.
Right. Yep, maybe. I don't know the literature myself well, but I think the kind of deepest logic of biblical faith is that the material world is good. I mean, that's the way that the creation narratives conclude. Is very good. And that human experience is normatively bodily experience. Problem is that our bodies are subject to breakdown into death. And so that gives rise to the hope for some kind of liberation. And one way to be liberated is to leave the body behind. And there are lots of religious traditions that focus on that. Other ways is to think of the transformation of materiality, and I think the resurrection of Jesus is the testimony to the transformation of materiality. Now, what that means from a scientific perspective is beyond my capacity to know, but That seems to be the basic claim.
I don't want to take up too much time, but I know in some Christian symbology they believe the sun is Christ and that Saturn was Satan, and in the morning the sun eclipses the stars and Saturn disappears. So I don't know how that's relevant to what I said, but...
No, I don't either. Yes?
Especially like we're mentioning what you probably do know well about the Jewish scholar, contemporary Jewish scholar, Paul P. Actually,
Yep.
being an Orthodox student,
Yep.
very strongly of the historical.
He does, yes, that's true. And sees it as a kind of vindication of the significance, prophetic significance of Jesus, but not as a proof that Jesus is who Christians claim he was. But does. I mean, and I think that's a that's a testimony to the strength of the historical evidence. That I've compiled here. That it's that even non-Christians can be persuaded by it. But if it's true, of course, it changes everything. I mean, if what I've said is half true, I mean, it really changes everything. This is not a kind of minor theme. This is the essence of it. Ross?
In terms of the materiality, the current sort of scientific sun is going to basically burn up like all other stars and somehow suck the earth into it like disappear.
Right.
How does this sort of materiality challenge that?
I don't know the science, although I've read some discussions around this. I mean, that is one conviction, isn't it? That eventually everything will implode and disappear. That may not be right. I guess our knowledge of reality is still very partial. But I think if there is truth to the Christian theological tradition, then it would suggest to me that however it works out scientifically, that God is invested in the creation, that the creation is something that, again, theologically speaking, is the expression of God's love. God is love, according to 1 John. God is love, not God just has love or God feels love. God actually is love. So love emerges out of the inner life of God, and one of the expressions of that love is the act of creation. It flows out in the historical act of creation. So it's not, I think, a kind of temporary experiment, but it's something that manifests the creative love of God, and therefore I think has a future. But the extent to which we can know how that's going to work out in practice is hugely limited. Yes.
Jesus he came back to people physically saw him. Did he actually die again before the Lord? So
Did he die again?
Well, yeah, what happened to him?
No, I think what the New Testament describes is a period in which he appeared to his followers and to others for 40 days. And then you have the story of the ascension into heaven, which marks the kind of end of that period. I don't think that necessarily means that Jesus was hiding on earth somewhere for 40 days and then got the elevator back to heaven. But that the ascension marks the end of a period when he appeared and appointed the apostles, appointed his authorized kind of followers. Paul describes his experience as the last of these episodes, even though it happened after the 40 days. Last of all, he appeared also to me. So I think that was a period where he authenticated this experience, but that came to an end. So certainly he did not die again. The whole message is that his experience was one of embodiment free from the scourge of death. So he ceased to appear on earth, but he continues to live and is known to us through the presence of the Spirit. Yes.
But you know how you were saying that what happened with Jesus is more than that these people is more than just going from having an afterlife and giving.
Yep.
Born and it's God's kingdom
Yep.
coming to earth. Is there a good book to sort of be introduced to that? Is that somewhat new?
No. I can recommend a book I haven't read. I mentioned Tom Wright's enormously big fat book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is, as I said, 820 pages. I've read every one of those pages, so I know that book, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because it is such a huge book. But he has written another book called, what's it called? Surprised by Hope, which people speak very highly of, which is not just about the resurrection of Jesus, but it's about the idea of the hope for the redemption of creation, which is prefigured in the experience of Jesus, and is supposed to be a very, very good book. So I guess that would be...
One of the kind of grey areas, confusing areas of Christian theology is the whole thing about immortality as
Yep.
opposed to resurrection.
Yep.
Could you say a bit more about that? Not necessarily as opposed, but alongside maybe.
Yeah. I suppose what I don't believe that the Bible teaches is the Greek notion of an immortal soul. So at its simplest, that is the notion that the soul is created immortal, and it either will go to live in heaven if it's a saved soul, or it will go to live in hell if it's a lost soul. But either way, the soul continues to exist. So immortality is built into the constitution of the soul. That's not, I think, what we find in the Hebrew understanding. In the creation story, Adam is made out of the ground of the earth, and then the spirit is breathed into the body, so it becomes an inspirited body. But the life is a gift of God, and immortality is a divine gift. It's not a constitutional property of the soul. So I believe in immortality in the sense that to participate in Christ is to participate in life, and that life will carry on through our natural death and take us to life beyond death. So immortality is, I think, part of the doctrine of salvation, but that the Christian hope is one of the redemption of creation, which is at an individual level the redemption of the body. So Romans 8 is really very clear about that. If the spirit of him who raised Christ from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So the destiny of us as human beings, I think, is to experience a form of embodiment in the future that is appropriate to the redeemed creation. And we see our first glance of that in this experience of Jesus.
As human beings or as Christian human beings?
Oh, well, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that the gift of life is intended for all and not reserved simply for confessing Christians. But I was talking about this with somebody at the break. I don't think that invites us to tip into a kind of trite universalism, which says that we never face the risk of missing out on immortality. Because I think the warnings of Jesus himself are pretty severe, that if we choose to habituate ourselves to sin and evil, we may end up being in a place where we are not suited to dwell in redeemed creation. We wouldn't fit. So I think there is a kind of moral obligation on us to choose life in the way we live. choose good life, so that we will belong in restored creation when it comes. But I personally don't believe that this is something reserved only for those who know about it in this life. If the objection to that is, then why bother with all this? Well, the answer is because it's true, and because it's good, and because it's liberating. It's the joy of knowing Jesus that gives meaning to our life. It's not only the security of what happens beyond death. But, to again quote myself from the coffee break, when we face death as individuals or the death of loved ones, the fact that what we believe is bigger than that is enormously important. I find it important to know that all this is even bigger than death. So I'm full of hope. Well, we should probably stop. Thank you.
Normally, Chris has the last word, but I want to give that not to me, but to you in a sense. The last sound, anyway. I'm going to invite you to express your thanks to Chris, but before I invite you to do that, just try and summarise what we've experienced over the last 6 weeks. I think it's fair to say we've experienced some robust material that's at the centre of the Christian faith, material that resonates with our experiences and the hope that we have. And over recent weeks, I've had multiple conversations with different people about how these lectures have resonated with some aspect of their living, their lives, and how very specific and sometimes very significant aspects of their living have been touched upon in your lectures, Chris, and how they have drawn great assurance and hope and be able to pass that on in some cases. So it's with all sincerity that I acknowledge that your sensitivity to how it is that you present the material to us, how you share that with us, Chris, recognising that the Holy Spirit is always at work. And so tonight we want to offer this token to you of our appreciation. For you as a scholar, as a communicator, and as a teacher, acknowledging the significant contribution that you make, not least of all to the St John's Lectureship in Christian Theology at Victoria University. And Chris, you foster the partnership between St John's and Victoria, but more importantly, you contribute significantly to the purpose of that partnership, which is to speak with a Christian voice into our context. And so we're thankful of just how you have been gifted to share God's truth with people. People are stirred by your teaching. We are stirred by your teaching. And so may God bless you and bless others through you. Thank you. I did promise you the last word, but I lied. I do want to just thank those who have organised the lecture series, the practicalities of that, to Rob Anderson and his team, who have done a great job of making sure that we're warm and that we have things to look at on the screen and that we have supper halfway through. So perhaps we could express our thanks to Rob and all the crew. Rob still has one job to do, and that's to pass you a brochure as you head out the door. This is an opportunity, an invitation for you to support the ongoing work that Chris does through the St John's Lectureship, and so we invite you to consider that and look to support the ongoing good stuff that Chris is doing. So thank you all for coming, and do keep an eye on the St John's website for future opportunities like this. Good night.